Actually, you've got your own little fan.
Hold on to your hat.
Everyone a minute to find their seats.
But I'm picking up that I brought my dog.
Steve.
Oh, really?
Travel.
Great.
All right. I am Jack Dixon, the Dean of the College of Marine Science at the University of South Florida, and I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's keynote address, which is a joint collaborative venture between the Blue Ocean Film Festival and the Eminent Scholars Series. It's a part of the College of Marine Science, sponsored by the Tampa Bay Times. And today, we're very fortunate to have speak to us Kalin Roberts from the University of York. So Kalin is a professor of marine conservation at the University of York, where he also did his degree in biology and a PhD in coral reef science. His research focuses on threats to marine ecosystems and species and on finding the means to protect them. His main research interests include documenting the impacts of fishing on marine life, both historic and modern, and exploring the effectiveness of marine protected areas. For the last 25 years, he has used his science background to make the case for stronger protection of marine life at both national and international levels. His award-winning book, The Unnatural History of the Sea, charts the effects of 1,000 years of exploitation on ocean life. And there will be a book signing opportunity at the end of this lecture for that book. His most recent book, Ocean of Life, How Our Seas Are Changing, shows how the oceans are changing under human influence and was shortlisted for the Royal Society Winton Science Book Prize. He's currently working on another book that describes the past and possible future of coral reefs. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Kalin Roberts.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and thanks to everybody for coming here. And it's a pleasure to be here. And what I want to do today is to give you a little kind of, in a nutshell, overview of why we need to be doing more for ocean conservation and why we need to reinvigorate efforts to protect the sea across much of the planet. Can we have the... Right. Winslow Homer. It's a much more appealing picture than a lot of logos, I think. But this is in the middle of the Gulf Stream. Fantastic shot, the sea brimming with sharks and somebody in dire peril. I love that clip. That was what some film students put together for the Royal Society Science Book Prize evening. And I think what it does is it captures the essence of the fact that the oceans are in trouble, and that means that we're in trouble. Looking around us here at the beautiful environment of the Keys and the coral reefs and the bay, it's quite hard to acknowledge and accept that contention that we're in such trouble. And if this was your first ever dive, dropping into the sea on the Florida Keys, you could be forgiven for falling in love immediately and thinking this is just the most fantastic place in the world. The colors, the vitality, the busyness of the scene, all of them captivate the imagination. And it's as easy to fall in love with a coral reef today as it was when I first saw a coral reef 32 years ago in the Red Sea. But these reefs are very different from the ones that were here 32 years ago. And this sort of scene, lovely as it is, unfortunately is rather changed. So if you look at the same area over a long period of time, and this is just a couple of panels showing Discovery Bay on the left-hand side, then and now, and Carisfoot Reef then and now, you can see that that is a very different place. And if Ponce de Leon were alive today and were fitted up with a scuba tank and put onto the reef, I wonder what he'd think about the state of the reefs today. I suspect that he'd be disappointed, probably very shocked. And there aren't the fish that he would have been familiar with in those days on these reefs, and that's partly because of the enthusiastic efforts of large numbers of people to rid the reefs of their large fauna, if you like. But this is a story which is very familiar. It's been told many times from Florida. And what I want to do is to look at a different part of the world, one that I'm very familiar with, and see if we can prove George Bernard Shaw wrong in the process, that we learn nothing from history. And I think we'd all agree with that sentiment, thinking about it for more than a minute or two. But I think we've got to try and prove him wrong and see what we can learn from history about how the marine environment has changed and how we need to change in order to bring it back to life. So the part of the world I want to look at is Europe, and this is a seaport on the east coast of England in the late 19th century, and what you can see here is just a stunning abundance of fish being brought in to the landings, and fish at that time were just prolific, incredibly so. And you might be forgiven for thinking this was the sea in its pristine state, and untrammeled, unaffected by people. Well, we can look at how our success in going fishing has changed from this period to the present, because one of the things that people have been doing in the UK is collecting fishery statistics for over 100 years. And so one of my students went back through that long time series back to 1889 and asked the question, how much fish were we landing then compared to today per unit of fishing power? So you've got to correct for how much fishing power has changed over that time series. And what you see here, and let me just switch to this microphone so that I can come away from the podium. I don't like standing behind the podium here. So what you can see here is that the 1880s were the point of maximum abundance in terms of our landings per unit of fishing power. And you can see how during the period up to 1920 or so, the landings came down steeply. Then there's this rise through to the middle of the 20th century, and then a crash down to the late 20th century. And the rise corresponds to the point where people started to think, hey-ho, we're not catching as much as we used to. There's bigger fish in more distant seas. And so they started going off to the Arctic and to the east coast of North America, to West Africa, and fishing there. And then in the 1960s and 70s, people started kicking them out of those places, and they had to come back to the home grounds. And so what we can do is contrast the beginning and the end of that. And in the 1880s, we caught 17 times more fish per unit of fishing power than we do today. In other words, it's 17 times harder to catch the same fish now as it was then. But that wasn't the beginning. I mean, that was only a waypoint in a changing ecosystem. And if you look at this quote from 1883, a Royal Commission of Inquiry that was held into the effects of fishing and bottom trawling on the seabed, what you can see is that already there were complaints about how the fish supply was falling, and people were finding it harder to make a living from the marine environment. Now we can go back in time a little bit further using data. So my student Ruth Thurston has pushed us back into the middle of the 19th century using data from those Royal Commission reports. And you can see that if we look at this, that 17 times greater is actually now not the peak of fisheries abundance. And if we look at going from the 1860s now, there's 25 times less fish in terms of the ability to catch them than there were then. To go back even further, we have to start looking at anecdotal reports, and I'll read this for you because it might be hard at the back. It's about an account of fishing in the Shetland Islands in the north of Scotland in 1844, and it says, "Beginning at one end, the lines are drawn in. We were extremely successful. Almost every hook held a fish, small tusk, large beautiful cod, skate, conger eel, saithe, or full-grown coalfish, but above all, halibut of various sizes, some of them gigantic, above 6 feet long. When these large fish or a powerful cod or skate appeared on the surface approaching the boat, the poor animal's struggles became frantic, and frequently we received showers of brine." So this is a time when big fish were very, very abundant indeed. And here's another difference in that time, and that is that the seabed was completely crusted with invertebrate communities. And one of the things that was there then, and which is not there now, is billions of oysters. And here you can see a quote from Northern Ireland. "The middle of Carlingford Loch is deep, and the bottom occupied by an immense bed of oysters, of which vast quantities are taken to Dublin and other towns." And they went on to say that the oysters were the size of horses' hooves, and they weren't that much esteemed, frankly, because the flesh was rather tough. These were old-growth oysters. They'd been there a very long time. You can still find their shells on the beaches there, but you won't find them underwater any longer. Going back even further in time, this is a bit of fun. When religious mores changed in Europe in the 17th century, in the 16th centuries, people switched from painting religious scenes to painting scenes from daily life, and they painted fish and fish markets quite a lot. And you can see here the sort of scenes that are in those paintings. And one of the things I got a student to do was to look at the size of the fish in those images. And it's hard to know how tall these people are, but there are some things which don't change very much. The distance between the eyes is one of them, and the size of the hands is another of them. And so you can use these as your benchmarks to get an estimate of size. And in this case, there's a cod right in the front of the scene, 126 centimeters. That's over 4 feet long. In fact, probably 5 feet long, I think. I'll do the arithmetic up here. But here you can see another of those giant cod on this different scene. Some large skate there as well. Another scene with dried skate up in the top of the picture. There are salmon steaks, huge cod again. Another scene on the shore. And taking all of these images together, you can build up a picture of the sort of sizes of things. Now, obviously, there could be artistic license going on here, and they might have chosen the very largest fishes that were around at the time. But what's interesting is that the fish that are depicted in these pictures are not outside the natural size range of the species. So they are true to life in that sense. They're not being exaggerated beyond the size that a fish will grow to. And you can see here just how large the cod, haddock, and salmon were in comparison with the sort of things that we're pulling out of the sea today. Now, the sea, then, is very different today from what it was then. And the question comes into mind, well, if there's been such an amazing transformation, why did it happen? Well, one thing that happens is that over time, fishing cleans up its act. And this is a self-correcting problem. So bycatch, the catch of all that incidental stuff in a fishery, is a self-correcting problem. And the reason for that is we catch it all. And so bycatch goes down over time. Inevitably, it provokes outrage early on, and in many of these reports that I was culling data and quotes from, those reports were inquiries made because people were complaining about the state of the fisheries. But what has happened is that over time, it all goes quiet for long periods because the perceived impact of those fisheries has gone down, but the impact itself has not gone down. And nowadays, what we have in many seas is what you might call the remnants of a once grand ecosystem. And this is how it is across much of European seas, off much of eastern Canada, for example. We've moved from this state where big fish are very abundant and highly varied to situations where all the seabed habitat has been scraped away by trawls, and what we have left are the rats, mice, and cockroaches of the sea. And incidentally, those do sustain productive fisheries, and so people are quite happy with that. From a conservation perspective, we shouldn't be quite happy with that at all. And the other thing is that when species disappear, they often go unnoticed, and over time, the collective memory that they were there in the first place wanes, and so there's this forgetting that takes place about what the possibilities are for the sea. You know, none of us were there in the early 19th century to see those fish landed on the beaches and the incredible abundance and size of them. And this phenomenon has been encapsulated by a couple of the greats of marine science, Jeremy Jackson and Daniel Pauly. And Jeremy Jackson was intrigued by all of these kinds of reports of incredibly abundant life in the past and enormous numbers of turtles in the Caribbean, for example, whereas Daniel Pauly was interested in fisheries and why it is that fisheries failed to account for these sorts of anecdotal reports of fish being much more abundant in the past. The thing about fisheries is it's very much focused on the present and the future. You have to know how many fish there are in the sea right now in order to predict how many it's safe to remove in the next year. And so, you know, history really isn't of much concern to a lot of fisheries science. And Daniel Pauly wanted to correct that. And together they coined the term shifting baseline syndrome. And shifting baselines, put in a nutshell, are intergenerational changes in the way that we perceive the world. So if you were to jump into the reef in the Florida Keys today, what you would see is a different world from the one that Ponce de Leon was familiar with. But to you, it's your baseline. And so baselines shift over time. And there are some things about human perceptions and cognition which make us prone to these kind of shifting baselines. And one is that our thinking is framed early on in life. So by the ages of about 8 or 9, 10 years old, we really think we know what the world is like, and our baseline has been set at that point to some degree. And the other thing that facilitates shifting baselines is a creeping, gradual change in the environment, which is hard for any one of us to notice happening in the background. So here's an example of a shifting baseline from this part of the world. Diana Nyad, very famous endurance swimmer, trying to cross from Cuba to the Florida Keys. She tried for the first time in 1978. She used a shark cage because the sea was full of sharks. And with the rough seas, it meant she had to give up. She started getting thrashed against the sides of the cage and didn't make it that time. Then she tried again, 2011, 2012, but this time no shark cage. No need for that. What stopped her was jellyfish. And then she finally made it in 2013 by protecting herself thoroughly from jellyfish, but not from sharks. And the sharks, you see, she was protected from by the activities of many people who had previously been out there fishing them down. So there aren't nearly as many sharks out there as there were before. So there are a whole series of cognitive biases which make us prone to this kind of forgetting, this collective amnesia. And here they are, you know, we trust our own experience to a much greater extent than we trust the experience of others. So we don't like to be told how the world is. We like to see it for ourselves and experience it for itself. And we often anchor ourselves on the first piece of information that we receive. And so that's early in life or the first experience that we have of something. And we can, you know, we box ourselves in by this rejection of new information which contradicts the paradigms that we have thought up, and we have a tendency to like things to stay much the same as they've always been, and that's true also of institutions and arrangements. Arrangements? Is that, yeah, there we go. And arrangements. which means that we like to preserve the status quo. So instead of doing something to change the way the world is, what we like to do is to... is this... it's very directional. Okay. Would you prefer me to use the podium mic? No? Okay. I shall do my best. So, those are the cognitive problems. But what does this all mean for us in terms of the marine environment and our relationship to it? Well, what happens over time is that we ratchet down our expectations of the marine environment as the abundance of life there changes. And as a result of that, we can come to accept the world in a way which is actually detrimental to our long-term interests and well-being. Now, an example of diminished expectations. This is one of a series of stamps which the UK Post Office put out earlier this year. And it's Cornish sardine, and it says proudly on the bottom, sustainable. Now, I had a hand in this. It was me who helped choose the species that went on these stamps. I wrote the text to accompany them. So, the responsibility for saying the Cornish sardine was sustainable comes down to me. But it's an example of a diminished expectation, really. Although we can take out Cornish sardines and not threaten the survival and viability of the stock, it's very different from the world that there was there hundreds of years ago. And here you can see a picture of pilchards off South Africa. And this is how it was in Cornwall as well. And yet that phenomenon has gone. Here's a quote from 1851. Pursued by predacious hordes of dogfish, hake and cod, and greedy flocks of seabirds, they advanced towards the land in such amazing numbers as actually to impede the passage of vessels and discolor the sea as far as the eye can reach. Of a sudden they will vanish from view and then again approach the coast in such compact order and overwhelming force that numbers will be pushed ashore by the moving hosts in the rear. In 1836, a shoal extended in a compact body from Fowey to the Land's End, a distance of at least 100 miles if we take into consideration the windings of the shore. So this was a phenomenon, the like of which has not been seen around the British coast in more than 100 years now. And we have come to accept as good something which has become so diminished over time. And here's another example of diminished ambition in nature conservation. The UK has embarked on a project to establish marine protected areas over the last few years. And here are the first 20